once again, if you have a question, quickly get a card and write it down and pass it up. I have one here, and so it's not actually really a question about the Supreme Court, but the Bush administration's reaction to the Supreme Court. What impact does the Supreme Court's recent decision on prisoners held at Guantanamo have on the Bush administration's disregard of habeas corpus? If you can speak a bit about that, habeas corpus, and whether or not we'll ever see habeas again.
Certainly, again, when the administration, when our federal law enforcement are trying to hold and to detain, often without charge, people often, not always, but often who are not citizens, and again, thus more vulnerable than many of us who are, they're fighting us tooth and nail on these sorts of issues. The D.C. Circuit Federal Appellate Court just this past week granted an order where the Bush administration has asked them to stop the going into effect of a federal district court order that said, take these Chinese people, these 17 people that you're holding in Guantanamo, into D.C. and release them because you no longer have a basis to. It was exercising its ability to use habeas corpus on their behalf. And the D.C. Circuit granted an expedited review, stopped that trial court order from going into effect, and said, give us briefing right away on whether or not the Bush administration, despite the Supreme Court decision guaranteeing some measure of judicial oversight, might nonetheless have a new way to get around that and deny people an independent judicial examination of their claims that this administration is continuing to act lawlessly in violation of the Constitution.
Thank you. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a card to you. Well, I think the answer to this question is it depends what happens in the election, but who is on the short list for the next Supreme Court judges? I suppose you might want to presume one or the other or both successful candidacies and maybe speculate about who might be on the horizon.
I think it's probably clearer what we would get in the case of a successful McCain candidacy, because he has been out there on his presidential campaign since before it was narrowed to him among the Republican contenders, deploying those favorite sort of conservative buzzwords, strict construction, and saying that he wants to appoint justices like Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, who are probably, in most fields, some of our most reliable opponents on the Supreme Court for ACLU positions. Orrin Hatch is one of the people who had been bandied about as a possible Bush nominee. He also is a devotee of so-called strict construction, but it might be that he wouldn't be palatable enough because he might be too old. And they might want to follow the strategy that George W. Bush used when it appointed John Roberts as Chief Justice and Sam Alito as Associate Justice to replace Justice O'Connor, of picking pretty darn youthful judges who are going to be on the court for decades to come, casting pretty reliable votes, at least based on those two justices' records so far, for orders increasing the strength of the presidency, decreasing the scope of constitutional rights, decreasing the ability of litigants to rely on the courts to check the elected branches of government. Barack Obama has said that no, that's not his approach, but he hasn't given us sort of clearer expectations, although of course we've all heard the rampant speculation about whether Hillary Clinton would become a Supreme Court justice in an Obama administration.
Thank you. Let me just quickly read these.
We do have just a couple more minutes left.
Yeah, we do. It's a question about Judge Judy here.
Probably outside my area of
expertise.
Primarily, thank goodness, Her Honor Judy doesn't regularly decide constitutional cases. God bless us all.
Well, here's what I'm going to ask, because I think this is personal. And it may get to the Supreme Court, but what happens to the marriage of same-sex couples in California if Proposition 8 passes?
Okay, so Proposition 8, which is on the November 4th ballot and would change our state constitution this time, not just our statutory law like Prop 22 back in 2000, says, quote, only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. If it were to pass and go into effect, it would immediately stop California from allowing any new same-sex couples to get married or to recognize the marriages of any new couples who may have gotten married in Massachusetts or one of the many other countries, or sorry, the increasing number of other countries, 6 as of January 1st, that allow same-sex couples to marry. We don't know what it will do to existing marriages. We don't know whether it will wipe out mine and the estimated 11,000 other marriages of same-sex couples that have been entered since the middle of June. The Attorney General of the state has issued an official opinion that it will not. There is one statement in the proponents' rebuttal to the argument against Prop 8 in the official ballot materials that says that it will wipe them out. If the measure were to pass, we would immediately see a lawsuit filed, I'm sure, that would ask the courts to stop it and to strike it down on the grounds that by taking away a fundamental right that the state Supreme Court has already held, that a group that has been subject to historical amounts of discrimination and therefore needs the highest level of judicial protection, so changes our fundamental premises of equal citizenship and the ability of our judiciary to use our state constitution's equal protection guarantees to protect unpopular minorities, that it shouldn't be counted as a mere amendment, but would actually be a deeper revision to our state constitution. Why does that matter? Revisions can't start through the petition process the way Prop 8 did. They would have to originate in the state legislature. I'll remind you that our state legislature has twice in recent years passed marriage equality bills, so it's extremely unlikely. So that's one thing that could happen. The other thing that could happen is they would ask people to strike down the amendment on federal constitutional grounds that you are singling out a discrete group for wiping out rights in a vast array, hundreds of state laws that make marriage matter, and thereby violating the federal equal protection guarantee. Personally, and as a constitutional scholar, I'm not very optimistic that this set of 9 justices in DC would be likely to buy that argument, which is why I'm doing everything I can to fight against Prop 8.
Okay, one last question, and I certainly hope you don't have to give back your wedding presents. This one is a problem that's really impacting many of us, whether we ever get there or not. It's increasingly certain that there's a pipeline from schools to prison for many minority youth, especially young people with disabilities, learning disabilities, and others go almost directly to jail these days. And the question is, privately run for-profit prisons are on the rise. Are there any challenges to the constitutionality of this prison industrial complex on the horizon that we can see?
The main sorts of challenges that you would be able to bring on constitutional grounds would require you to find what we call state action. You would have to find action by the government in operating or running these institutions. Now, part of the problem is that starting somewhat with the Burger Court and then accelerating under Chief Justice Rehnquist, the U.S. Supreme Court has cut back the circumstances under which it will recognize that there is enough government involvement in some area, or that an area is one that has really traditionally been the purview of government, so we should see farming it out to private companies as an impermissible attempt to skirt constitutional restriction. These courts have made it very hard to do that. They cut way back on Warren Court racial civil rights era precedents, and it would be extremely difficult, and it would only get more difficult with the kinds of justices that I talked about one side wanting to appoint.
Okay, thank you. I think we should give David a huge round of applause. Wish him all the best with his